Hi, we continue in 1 Kings 1 today after Adonijah has risen up and made himself king, gathered a coalition, offered sacrifices, and now those who are not on his side have to decide what to do. And that's where we are, as you can see on the left side of the screen in verse 11, as we continue through these first two chapters of the succession narrative in the first book of Kings. If you haven't watched my two introductory videos, the first one to the two books of Kings overall, and the second one to these first two chapters, I go over first some questions about the entire two books, and then some of these questions. And right now we're on this section down here. We already looked last time what the two coalitions for against Adonijah tell us about the lines of power. Although, as I noted last video, we'll see more about that when Solomon is firmly established as king and establishes the shape of his reign in chapter 4. So now we're on this section. What is the role of Nathan, who appears here out of nowhere, last having been seen in 2 Samuel 12, when Bathsheba gave birth to Solomon? And so there's a question about that. And similarly, this scene here, number 9, how do we interpret the Nathan-Bathsheba approach to David on behalf of Solomon? Because as we looked at last time, some scholars, such as Joel Baden and Brooke Halpern, from the evidence we've seen, assume that David meant Adonijah to be king, and there is much evidence to support that. And yet now Nathan and Bathsheba are going to go to David and say, didn't you say Solomon should be king? So one of the questions we have to look at, and that goes to number 10 here, is how do we understand David's state of mind and capacity? As we saw in the first verses, there are a number of indications that David is losing it. The fact that he can't get warm suggests he's lost his sexual virility, and the several instances of he didn't know suggest that he's perhaps senile. But we've already seen in the Absalom rebellion story, and even earlier when he was fighting against Saul and hid amongst the Philistines, that he could pretend to be something else. And so David is a changeling, not quite like a trickster like David, but he can certainly pretend who he is not and hide behind a royal visage. So is he still doing that? Most scholars assume he's actually old and senile here. But the point that he'd chosen Adonijah to be king, and now they come to suggest he said Solomon should be king, really raises that question. And we're not able to resolve it because the text doesn't give us enough information. So as interpreters, it's one of those things where we have to sit in the ambiguity or decide for ourselves. And we'll get to question number 11 next time. So as we look at the overall structure of the Solomon narratives, as we see here, the succession takes place in these two chapters. And amidst the succession, suddenly, as we saw after the opening scene with Abishag, which is very quiet, I noticed the Chekhov's gun element of that she seems to disappear, but she will reappear later, like a gun that appears in the first scene of a play, must return later, as Chekhov taught writers. So now we get to this scene here, Nathan saying to Bathsheba. And in this standard keywords and shape format that I've been using throughout Radical Bible, you can see some of the elements that are going on here. The my lord the king repeated over and over and over again. The repetition, as we noted that Mordecai Coogan highlighted last time, that this chapter features much repetition, although there's variation in the repetition, which we'll also look at. But you see here the exact repetition, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king and shall sit on my throne, and here it is exactly the same. So there's a number of repetitions going on here. Perhaps that's meant to fog David's mind with repetition. Certainly no, from advertising, political or otherwise, repetition has a way of penetrating us. But there's also more going on, because as we see already in verse 11, if you count them, there are 6 names in this verse, in this one verse: Nathan, Bathsheba, Solomon, Adonijah, Haggith, and David. And so suddenly there's all kinds of names. So what happens if we look at this a little differently? What happens if we look at it this way and we highlight the names and not the key words? And I've left some of these key phrases highlighted here, but notice what happens when we look at simply the names. Suddenly we see how they're flooding all over the place. And it makes it very difficult for readers, if we don't go really slow like I'm trying to do in this series, even if I'm talking quickly, at least we're going slowly through the text to highlight what's going on so we don't get a false impression from it just rushing right past us. And perhaps that's exactly what they're trying to do with David, is to flood him with information and get Solomon on the throne before David stops to go, wait a minute, what's going on? But there's something else going on here, because these names have a very interesting set of meanings. So let's just look at that for a moment and see. David, as we saw earlier, of course, means beloved, and that's been an interesting thing all along. Abishag has a very unusual name. Either my father is a wanderer or is an error. There's the ab beginning. Almost always means something about father. Who would name their daughter, my father is an error? So that can't really be it. It must be something like my father is a wanderer. But Abishag isn't a key character, and we don't know that much about her, so we'll let her go. But the others establish quite a pattern, especially given the two themes in 1 Kings in these first chapters. One is who's going to be king, and the second is who's going to be king and is Yahweh on their side, and the second about building the house of Yahweh, and is that part of Yahweh's plan at all? So the monarchy and the temple, the two elements of an established empire, or monarchy in this case, are at issue, and the names highlight something that's going on. Because Adonijah, who we know is going to lose, his name means Yahweh is my Lord. And Joab, who's going to die, means Yahweh is Father. And Zadok, who's going to end up on Solomon's side and therefore succeed, his name means justice. Abiathar, the priest who's going to be exiled, means father of abundance. Benaiah, who's head of the mercenary, the Cherethites and the Pelethites, means built by Yahweh. What might that say about the temple? The name Nathan means simply gift. If we add a prefix or a suffix, we can get gift of God, either in the form Nathaniel or Jonathan. And Bathsheba means either daughter of the oath or seven, with Sheba having the double meaning of oath or seven, like Beersheba, which means seven wells, Beer meaning well. But Solomon has two names, and we might forget that Nathan gave him a name in 1225, Jedediah, which means beloved of Yahweh. Notice the did in the middle is similar to David. The V in the David in the English is simply representing what's a silent consonant there. It would be pronounced in Hebrew Daud, and here it's Jedediah. So the vowel is different, but recall that in biblical Hebrew the vowels are not there in the visual text in writing. So it's really David with a Jah in the beginning, beloved of Yahweh, rather than simply beloved. But the name we know him by, Solomon, means either peaceful or complete, from Shalom. A Shlomo is literally what it means, so a person of peace, as he's about to kill 3 people. So whether we read these as ironic or as prophetic, we have to decide. But note how the chapter looks if we put their names in as they mean. So on the left side, we have, then Nathan said to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. On the right side, we have, then Gift said to daughter of the oath, Peaceful's mother, have you not heard that Yahweh is my Lord, son of Haggoth, sorry, I didn't include that one in there, has become king. So it looks very different that way, and I know that makes it awkward to read, and I won't follow it that way. But I would encourage you to look at that to see how hearing the names, much like when indigenous names of North America are translated into English as things like Sitting Bull, we might understand something about what their symbolic meaning is, if, of course, we understand the symbolism of a given indigenous culture, which often white people from outside did not know or were not interested in finding out. But within the context of the Bible, we can know something about the cultural context of the Hebrew being used here, as we've been exploring throughout. So you can see how these names play out as we go. But to keep it simple and to make it more readable for our eyes, I'll just put their names in here as we continue. So jumping right into our text, starting in verse 11. So as Beale notes here about the shape of 11 to 13, I didn't arrange it this way, but we can just hear it in what she says. She says, Nathan's speech to Bathsheba follows a chiastic pattern in which the outer shell, here 11 and 13 at the end, focus on kingship. Adonijah has become king, and then is Adonijah king. And the inner core focuses on Bathsheba's personal concerns here, saving her life and her son Solomon's life. That's the inner core by which he seeks to appeal to her. And as my note below has, the Nathan and Bathsheba conspiracy to convince the old David to replace the older son with the younger parallels that of Jacob and Rebekah to convince Isaac to replace the older Esau with the younger Jacob. If that's actually what's happening in that story or here. So notice if we pause to consider that parallel, there I took it as Rachel and Jacob were conspiring not to convince old not seeing Isaac, but that Isaac and Rebekah were conspiring to convince to convince Jacob that he could fool his father so that he could prepare to go back to the old country and fool his wily uncle Laban. Here, is it similar? Is David really incapable, like Isaac wasn't really incapable, even though the presumption was that he was incapable? Nathan and Bathsheba here are not exactly like Rachel and Jacob, mother and son, but perhaps Nathan is something like a father to Bathsheba. Let's look a little more closely at what we know. Bathsheba we haven't seen since the birth announcement. Let's go back to that just for a moment here, and we saw it simply here. David consoled his wife Bathsheba and went to her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he named him Solomon. Yahweh loved him and sent a message by the prophet Nathan. So he, that is to say Nathan, named him Jedediah because of Yahweh. So that's the last time we saw them, and Nathan and Bathsheba tightly wound into the story of Solomon right there. But if you look at my note further below, we can see that her grandfather was David's counselor Ahithophel, who killed himself when his counsel to Absalom was rejected. Let's go back and look at the two genealogical aspects that can tell us a little more about who Bathsheba is. So back to 2 Samuel 11:3, we see David is told, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So already something to note, and we noted at the time, that Bathsheba was married to a foreigner. And from the perspective of the Deuteronomic history from Deuteronomy 7, when marrying foreigners or even interacting with foreigners was considered idolatry, or the cause of idolatry, and would lead to Yahweh's wrath. And ultimately, we'll see in chapter 11, that's the reason stated by the Deuteronomic historian for why Solomon's son loses so much of the reign, is because his foreign wives led him astray. Here there's not a foreign wife, as we'll see her father Eliam is from within a town within Judah, but her husband is a foreigner. And that just creates an interesting aspect of what's being accepted here and whether the Deuteronomic historian is an element of what's going on in our immediate story. Certainly that would seem to be contrary to the ideology of what we're seeing, that foreignness leads to exile. So that's one element. And the other element in chapter 23 of 2 Samuel was a list of David's 30 warriors. And it's an obscure list, and most of the readers just jump right through it. But notice what we have here. Eliam, son of Ahithophel, the Gileonite, was one of David's 30 chief warriors. And so her grandfather was Ahithophel, and who ended up working for Absalom. And we were wondering in the Absalom rebellion why Nathan was so silent. Well, maybe that's one of the reasons, that he was caught in between a sense of family loyalty to Bathsheba, and yet that her grandfather, who had been David's counselor, was now working for Absalom. So all kinds of lines of conspiracy and loyalty and things that may be violated in various ways. And one more time, I just want to highlight for scholars who want to read this whole story as written a couple of hundred years later, so much of what we'd want to know about their thinking wouldn't be known 200 years later, and plainly are gaps in the story in interpreting it. But if it was written at the time it was happening, perhaps the audience it was intended for within royal circles would have well known what David was thinking and what Nathan was thinking and what Bathsheba was thinking, and might find this story interesting in the way one might read a newspaper or magazine article now, or a website article about an event that we are a part of, where we can read between the lines because we have information that readers of the text who are not part of it don't have. So that's just an ongoing question we have to look at as we go through. So he says to Bathsheba, noting Solomon's mother, and again emphasizing that Adonijah's mother Hagoth is not to be seen here, "Have you not heard?" And there's an interesting question there. Why would he have heard and she not heard? Where is she? We don't know. Where is this conversation taking place? We don't know. But clearly he's heard, and he implies that she hasn't heard. And she says nothing here. He speaks for 4 verses here, and she goes to Acts. But this is all just Nathan talking. So we have no idea how she's feeling, what she's thinking, if she agrees with him, or if she's just following orders. Maybe he has power over her in a way we don't quite understand, as perhaps an elder, and he's just exerting power. But again, we don't know. So have you heard that Adonijah, son of Hagoth, has become king? It's a fait accompli. It's not has raised himself up to become king. He has become king. And our Lord David does not know it. Notice not your husband David or your man David, but our shared Lord does not know it. Highlighting, as you can see below, the knowing theme that we've looked at. He did not know Abishag sexually, and here he doesn't allegedly know about this, and there are others along the way. But does Nathan really believe that David doesn't know about it? Do we believe that David doesn't know about it? As I was noting last time, and as we'll see again when Adonijah comes to Bathsheba to plead with her for Abishag, to go to David to give Abishag to him, he says that all Israel is on his side, and the narrator told us that all the men of Judah had come to his celebration. So if Nathan knows about it and all the men of Judah know about it, is it really credible that David doesn't know about it? Does Bathsheba not know about it? But in any event, he continues without pausing to see if she answers his rhetorical question. Now therefore come, let me give you advice, or more literally on the other side, let me give you advice, please, so that you may escape with your own life and the life of your son Solomon. But again, much going on there. Let me give you advice. The next time we'll see giving advice is Rehoboam, Solomon's son, seeking advice from the people around him. And he gets some good advice and he gets some bad advice, as we'll see in chapter 12. And the premise is, so you may save your own life and the life of your son. But why is her life at risk? When Adonijah is killed by Solomon, we don't hear anything about Haggith's life being at risk. Halberstam and Holmes note below, rather than eliminating the blood feud, dynastic monarchy merely displaces it. The intrafamilial bloodletting that afflicts dynastic succession represents a transfer inside the king's household of the blood feud that before the advent of monarchy had ravaged clans and tribes and exposed the Israelites to foreign conquest. And much of what they're about there is how the end of the book of Judges shows this brutal violence between Benjamin and Israel. And the end of Judges is there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So the idea is that they were fighting amongst themselves, and having a king could help them take their violence and impose it upon outsiders. In other words, using a scapegoat mechanism to bind them together under one king against people like the Philistines or the Canaanites in the Deuteronomistic theology of it. But again, it's inconsistent here, because why would she be at risk when Haggith isn't at risk? So we don't know if this is really true or if Nathan's trying to frighten her into action. Either way. Save your own life here, nephesh, twice in the verse. I just want to note that because nephesh is sometimes translated as soul in the New RSV, which is a concept completely foreign to the Hebrew scripture. And plainly, what at issue here is not saving her soul. It doesn't mean soul. That's not a biblical concept. It means life, as in what God created in Genesis 2:7 by breathing the breath of life into the topsoil and turning it into an Adam, a human being. And the life of your son Solomon. So having set the premise, now he gives this advice. Go in at once, and literally it's two different verbs, come and go, highlighting the action that's going on here. And you see this here on the right side of the screen. To King David, again, not your husband. First it was our Lord David, and now it's King David. And my note notes the overwhelming use of Melech in these verses for king, 13 times in 5 verses. And if we look back at the shape based on key words, we can see that here. My Lord the King, 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 King here. So this is what Nathan tells her to say to him. Did you not, my Lord the King, so combining the two, Lord David, King David, and now my Lord the King, with no name, and the refrain listed throughout here. Notice my note below has throughout the passage, Bathsheba never refers to a relationship with David. It's as if she's just some person from the town that is coming in and needing help. Swear to your servant, a play on Bathsheba here, Nishabetha, like Bathsheba here, to swear, and the play on Sheba, to your servant, or literally your Amma here, which is a female slave, saying, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king. And notice this gets repeated 5 times in the rest of the chapter, as Falkelman notes, highlighting if you say it enough, it can become reality. And he shall sit on my throne. And throne as well, we see how much throne is a key word throughout as the symbol of monarchy. And then the final thing is to ask the second rhetorical question, then why is Adonijah king? And his plan continues, then while you're still speaking, I'll come in and confirm. Let's look at a little more detail. Note that she offers no counterplan or questions at all. We have no idea what she thinks of this whole plan or what she's feeling. There's not a hint of it. So the then hides it, the New RSV always hides, Hannah, behold, and I corrected it on the right side. So behold, while you are still there speaking, and the Hebrew is such as suggesting speaking repetitively because she doesn't have a lot to say. He's just given her this much to say. It'll obviously take just a few seconds to say. So he's suggesting that she will just keep talking for a while, and while she's talking, he'll come in, which implies that he has to be waiting just outside the door, which means that anybody who's part of the king's people knows he's waiting outside the door while she's talking to him, and he will come in and fill in the words. So that's the conspiracy here between Nathan and Bathsheba. Will it work? We'll have to wait until next time to see. See you then for that.